Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and my guest today. Good to see you, Senator.
Thank you for having me.
So are the words from the President or the Secretary of State going to be good enough to solve this increasingly difficult situation?
Well, I think you've outlined some of the criticisms that my colleagues have made and that I have made in the past about the President's foreign policy, and certainly mistakes that this administration and other administrations have made are factoring into all of this. But I certainly think that now the right steps are being taken. We need to continue to do more. We need to focus on two things. First, we have to keep this from getting worse. That means doing what we can to help the government in Kiev to transition to normalcy, make sure this doesn't expand into eastern Ukraine and beyond that. But second is there has to be a price to pay for what they have done, particularly an economic and a diplomatic price to pay. We cannot allow the established norms in the 21st century to be that a government can simply move into a neighboring country when they don't like the political direction their neighbor is headed.
Yeah.
And if we allow that to stand here, we're going to see that happen in more and more places around the world, particularly in Asia. This could spread.
So I know that you wrote sort of this 8-step plan that you were sending basically to President Obama about what you would do. One of the things was that Russia should be expelled from the G8, and that we should try as Americans to rally the allies to boycott the G8. Do you really see that happening? Because we're getting some pushback now from Europe.
Well, first of all, I think in terms of expelling them from the G8, I think that's a realistic goal. That the G8 is supposed to be a collection of mature economies and mature democracies. Russia is not a mature democracy under President Putin. Beyond that, I think our allies have been a bit reluctant because they are very dependent on trade with Russia and on energy from Russia. One of the long-term things that was not part of those 8 ideas, but one that we should examine, is what does domestic energy production from the U.S. means in terms of freeing up some of the other sources of energy in Europe to remain within those countries so that they're not as dependent on Russia in the future as they've been in the past. I think that's an important part of it, because the one thing that gives Russia leverage on their neighbors is the amount of natural gas and oil that they produce and sell to their neighbors. And so that's where the reluctance is coming from.
I think some of those European nations rely on them by 30% as far as the oil and the gas reserves. I want to call your attention to an editorial that was written by Dana Milbank today in the Washington Post. It said in part, quote, "Obama is neither tyrant nor pushover. In general, the criticism of him being inconsistent and indecisive is closer to the mark. But the accusation that he has been feckless in Ukraine is still dubious because those demanding a stronger response have been unable to come up with one." Is that correct in your mind, or do you think that people have come up with other options?
Well, there have been other options, and certainly, look, I'm pleased with the fact that many of the options that I put forth, they're taking. I also think that there is going to be a time here to be retrospective, continue to be critical about the President's foreign policy. In a time of crisis, I personally try to avoid that because I think it undermines U.S. interests around the world. That being said, I will tell you that since my first days in the Senate, I have been very skeptical, quite frankly negative about the so-called reset with Russia, not because I didn't hope our country wouldn't have a better relationship with the Russians, but because I understood, as many people did, that what Vladimir Putin was not interested in better relationships. He was interested in growing the influence and power of Russia over the world and its neighbors, often at the expense of the United States. And so you have the President continuing to talk about entering these agreements with the Russians, when in fact the Russians have basically violated every agreement they've entered into in the past with us or anyone.
Senator Marco Rubio out of Florida today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.